everyone, and welcome to Thinkling's Books. My name's Deborah, and today we're going to be talking about how to edit your own book. Now, I am going to give you a step-by-step process, but before we get into that, I would like to go over a little bit of what I will and will not be covering, along with a slight disclaimer. First of all, there are, generally speaking, approximately 4 levels of editing. There's developmental editing, which generally takes place during the writing process and looks at the book as a whole and its structure. There's substantive editing, which looks at the book's structure and things like consistency and characterization within the book and scene to scene. There's copy editing, also called line editing, which looks at the book on a sentence and paragraph level for structural flow, logic, argument, repetition issues. And finally, there is proofreading, which looks for typographical errors and style guide errors. Now, I'm not going to be talking today about developmental editing because that takes place during the writing process, so maybe I'll discuss it a little more on a later episode on good writing practices. I'm also not going to be covering in extreme detail proofreading, although it will be part of it. The reason for this is that all books need to be professionally proofread by someone other than the author, which means that even professional proofreaders need to get someone else to proofread their books. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that proofreading takes an extremely specific skill and knowledge set. So you have to be the sort of person who has an extremely precise eye for details, and you have to have encyclopedic knowledge of the particular style guide you're using. If you just write fiction, I do generally recommend simply using the Chicago Manual of Style, which is widely used and just generally easy on the reader. The second reason that you always need your book professionally proofread is an issue that I'm going to be discussing throughout because it's a problem with all editing. And that's simply that you're so close to your book that a lot of times, instead of seeing what is actually in your book, you're seeing what you expect to see or what you would have written because your styles are so similar. So unless you're a professional proofreader and it's been 25 years since you wrote your book and you haven't reread it since and you've completely forgotten it, and you're a very, very different person, someone else needs to be the one proofreading your book. And preferably more than one proofreader if you can manage it. So, today I will be going over how to substantive and copy edit your book. But before I get started, one brief disclaimer, and it's this. Professional editors exist for a reason. They are very good at what they do, and they have done it a lot. I like to think about it like this. An unproofread book is like grilling stew meat. No matter how good a chef or writer you are, stew meat just shouldn't be grilled, man. It's not good. If you follow the instructions and the suggestions that I'm going to give you throughout this video and self-edit your book, it's like grilling with sirloin. If you're a good chef, you can make a really tasty meal with sirloin. But it's never going to be as good as if you hire a very good professional, because that is like grilling with ribeye. The downside to ribeye is it's going to cost you a pretty penny, whereas sirloin you can get pretty cheaply if you know where to look. That being said, here are basically the things that I myself do to make my own books better in preparation for being published. Step 1. You have finished the rough draft of your book. How do you feel about it? If your answer is pretty good, or not good but I have no idea how to fix it, then your next step is to get your book critiqued. Now, critiquing can be done by a professional. You can hire critiquers to go over your book and tell you the good and the bad. But if there are people in your life who are, and this is important, discerning readers who read your genre, and are people you trust, then you can use them to critique your book. And ideally, I like to start off with 3 critiquers, and among my critiquers, I try to get a variety of different people, not 3 people who are sort of similar and think in the same ways. I want to get people who look at the world from different angles, but all of whom love fantasy, which is what I generally write. So, ask these 3 people to critique your book, and then give them a reasonable amount of time, which is usually 2 to 3 months, to read it and then type up their thoughts and then get back to you. This also gives your brain a little bit of a break, because something we'll be talking about throughout that I've already mentioned once is you want to be a little bit more distant from your book. You want to forget it a little bit so that when you look at it again, your eyes are fresher. So now, 2 or 3 months have passed. Your 3 critiques come in. The next thing you should do is, before you look at the critiques, especially if these are emails, send an email back saying, "Thank you so much for your critique." And then do not send them another email on the topic for at least 2 days and preferably a week. Because if you're anything like me, once you look at the critique, your reaction will be like this. But I thought it was perfect. I thought you were going to tell me it was the best book ever. Why are you pointing out all these problems? You're wrong. It is perfect. And I'm a professional editor. You think I know better. But I don't. This happens every single time. So, give yourself a week. A week to think it over and say, okay, well, maybe they have a point after all. And don't do anything to your book yet. Make sure you have all 3 critiques in before you touch your book, and then give it more time. Wait. If you can wait a couple of months, maybe even 6 months, that would be ideal, but at least wait a couple of weeks. Let their ideas and their responses seep in. Oftentimes, good critiquers will give suggestions on how to fix a specific problem, and sometimes you can fix problems in really simple ways that don't require massive changes. But regardless, make sure, remember, you know your book best, make sure that you are changing your book in a way that makes sense, that answers their critiques, and that fits with your vision. Now, a note here before I go on. If you aren't yet content with where your book is, but you do know where you want to take it, hold off on the critiques and do this next step first, and then do critiques afterwards, and then repeat this step. So the next step is to completely rewrite your book. And by completely rewrite your book, I don't mean rewrite the problematic areas and then copy and paste the rest. And I don't mean edit it. I mean rewrite every single word. If you're going to give in to temptation, print it off and rewrite it from that. If not, I often do a split screen. I'll have my old document on the left and my new document on the right, and I will look at one and retype the other. Or, if I'm a time crunch, I'll even use a Word document on the left and Write or Die 3, which is a wonderful program. I'll link it in the description below, on the right. Retype the whole thing and try to do it at a fairly good pace. You don't want to very, very slowly rewrite it over the course of a year, because you'll begin to forget. And one of the things you're going to do while you're rewriting is check continuity. So a lot of times when you're writing, especially if you've been writing the same book for years, is you simply forget bits that you wrote earlier. And so your continuity is a little bit off, or you have, you're dropping hints for things that don't happen, or you're not dropping hints when you really should be. So continuity and consistent characters, we're in the substantive editing here, in case you're wondering, are things you should fix. But also keep in mind, what sort of writer are you? Are you a very florid writer, or are you a very sparse writer? Do you have certain other strengths or weaknesses? Because now is the time to compensate. I personally, like most editors, tend to be a fairly sparse writer. So when I rewrite, my rewrites end up significantly longer, sometimes as much as a third longer than the original, because I'm adding in a lot of description. On the other hand, a lot of non-editors are very florid writers and will go on these wandering digressions in their story, things that just need to be cut, descriptions that need to be cut in half. So just be aware of what kind of writer you are. So, you've rewritten your entire book. What is your next step? Well, get it critiqued again. If you haven't gotten it critiqued before, this can be your first critique. If you have, this is what I like to personally do, is send the book back to my first 3 critiquers and send it to 2 new critiquers so that I can hear both whether I fixed the problems for the original critiquers and whether the new critiquers see anything fresh, because their eyes will be fresher. This works a lot better if the rewrite and edit process has taken you a year than if it's taken you 3 months and your critiquers are like, we just spent ages reading this, we don't want to read it again. So choose your audience carefully on whether you should actually be asking this of people and whether these people are willing to do it, and whether, when the time comes, you will do it for them in return. But if you can manage it, send it back to be critiqued a second time. Again, make sure these are critiquers who are discerning readers whom you trust. Now that you've gotten their critiques back, you can choose either to rewrite the entire book again, which is a very good practice. I believe always in rewriting books. I think that it always just makes for better written books in the end, but I do understand it can be extremely time consuming, and if you are in a time crunch and if there aren't major problems that require big developmental changes, you can skip this step and go directly on to the step after this, which is reading aloud your book. Now, by reading aloud your book, I don't mean, and then she looked behind her and saw there was a stair, and then she went up the stairs. I don't mean speed reading. And I don't mean half reading, half skimming, half mumbling to yourself. I mean read it properly. Read it as if you were an audiobook reader. Say, and then she went to the stairs and she looked up them. Ideally, you want to, just in case you have infinite people in your life who just really want to read your books. But I have a friend whom I read aloud to. She loves being read aloud to, and I love reading aloud, and we like similar books. And so I will read aloud to her, and she's quite an expressive listener. So she will laugh or gasp or occasionally make comments, but she's not constantly interrupting me. For the most part, she's just listening attentively while doing some mundane task that doesn't take any brain power. It's really helpful to have an expressive listener like this, because it's like you are hearing what they are hearing. So if they're gasping in all the right places and laughing at all the right places, then you know that you are correctly communicating in your book what you want to communicate. But if they laugh when they really shouldn't be laughing, ask them why they laughed and then fix it. And yes, that totally happened to me. I think I was 21 or 22 at the time. I was reading aloud The Monsters of Stephen Enchanter to this friend, and I said the word gore, as in, like, entrails. It's a sort of violent book. Anyway, I used the word gore, and she laughed. I was like, why did you laugh? And she said, the word gore is funny. And I realized, you know, the word gore is sort of, funny is not exactly the word for it, but it's a bit of a cheap word in some ways, which can be purposeful, and it can be used very effectively in situations that are meant to be funny. But this was a serious action scene, and no, I needed to fix it. So I did, and it was really useful. That being said, if you absolutely cannot find anyone to read it aloud to, read it aloud to your computer or read it loud to the wall. And if you're really hardcore, record an audiobook of it. Because an audiobook will force you to go over again and again and again every single little sentence, so that you can no longer deny when something doesn't read right. So reading your book aloud will allow you to do several things. First, if you're reading aloud to someone, you can hear their reaction in real time. Second, you are incorporating more senses, so you're hearing as well as seeing a sentence, and that allows you to better figure out whether it flows properly. We're in the copy editing stage now. Whether it flows properly and whether it seems natural and whether it is easy to read. And it will also allow you to make a series of what you might call Freudian slips. In other words, you read a sentence slightly differently from how it's written. Maybe you do or do not use a contraction, or you use a slightly different word. When you do this, for the most part, pay attention, because there's a good likelihood that you're reading it in a way that is more natural than the way it's written. And unless it's causing a lot of redundancies within the text to do it this way, it's a good idea to change it. Finally, reading aloud will better allow you to catch redundancies, especially in specific overused expressions or words. So there's a concept here that I like to call invisible words, and I actually have a blog post on it which I will link below. Invisible words are words that are so frequent and so largely void of meaning that we tend to not see them when we read or write. We tend to overlook them as if they're invisible. These are words like all, just, even, of course, well, but also sometimes descriptions. One of the most vastly used over words is smile. People are always smiling or occasionally grinning, and descriptions are constantly using people's eyes. But you don't need this level of repetition. You don't need to be saying very, even, just, of course, well, every other sentence. And even though it's invisible, it will weigh down your story. So what I like to do, before I read aloud, I'll start with a frequency check using Microsoft Word, the find panel on the side. So Control F, not the find replace dialog box. Because Control F on the side will highlight every iteration of the word so you can see how often you actually use it. And just go through and delete all the ones that you don't need. Now, if you don't know what the invisible words that you personally overuse are, because every writer is slightly different, you can ask someone, and you can look at my list of invisible words because that will give you some common ones, but you can also use a frequency check. There are free online programs which will allow you to just copy and paste your novel in, and then it will list by frequency the most common words that appear in your story. On top you'll have a and the and he and I and of and on and so on. But if you have right very far up, you probably overuse the word right, because that shouldn't be a sufficiently frequent word that you have used it 500 times in your 500-page novel. That's too often. On the other hand, frequency counters aren't that helpful when it comes to more noticeable, non-invisible words that are overused. I was recently looking at a manuscript that used the word frequently twice in 2 paragraphs. And then only 3 times in the entire book. When we are writing, our brains get to thinking certain words, and so we'll tend to use them close together. And the word frequently can definitely be used 3 times in a manuscript, that's fine, but it can't be used twice in 2 paragraphs. And when you are reading aloud, that tends to be easier to catch. Similarly, overused expressions or descriptions can be easier to catch. I once read a book I love actually, in which characters, their lips were always quirking. I mean, that's a great description, but it happened a lot. I read another book that had the word little on almost every single page. There's a drain. Little is a fairly frequently overused word. Finally, there are certain words that should only be used once in a manuscript. These are very uncommon words, words that will jump out at a reader because they don't see them very often. And I have 2 examples of this actually. One is and they're both from books I like. One is from, I believe it's The Mystery of Edwin Drood, one of Dickens' books. He uses the word appellation twice, appellation as in name, what someone is called. And I'd never heard that word before, and so I looked it up and I found the Latin root. and I remembered it. So when he used it a second time, I noticed it. Of course, in Dickens' day, that might not have been considered weird. On the other hand, we have a more modern book, Diana Wynne Jones's The Lives of Christopher Chant, in which she uses the word bumptious twice. Bumptious is not a word you see very often, and again, I had never come across it before. It means arrogant, by the way. And so I looked it up, and then she used it a second time, and it was really noticeable to me because it was such an unfamiliar word. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. Finally, overused descriptions. I mentioned smile and eyes before, but each writer has some fairly unique ones. I sometimes overuse licking lips. Licking lips, you can do it 2, maybe 3 times in a manuscript. I had it in there about 7 times. So if you're not sure what to do, by the way, look up emotion thesauruses. I'll put a link to one in the description below. Emotion thesauruses are basically, what are the physical signs of being angry? Now you can demo this for yourself. You can go like, okay, what if I'm really angry? What am I doing? Hands are claws, shoulders are tensed, face is crunched, lined to the lips, crunched brow, narrowed eyes, maybe a more gravelly, aggressive tone. So you can figure it out for yourself, but if you have a character who's very different from you or is in a situation you're not familiar with, an emotion thesaurus will give you just a list of different physical manifestations of different emotions. So, you're reading your book aloud. At least once. It's great if you can do it more than that. This is your copy editing technique, and I find it highly effective at both copy editing and really as much proofreading as you as a writer can do. If you need to make any changes, you can always repeat any of these steps again. Otherwise, your book is probably ready to go to a professional proofreader to get a final once-over. I hope that you found this description of how to edit your own book useful. If you did, please give this video a like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to learn of new videos. Also, if you happen to know of any great editing tips for working on your own book, please do leave them in the comments below. I, for one, am always looking to learn new things. Until next time.